Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Goff, co-president of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And as Naomi Sandweiss just mentioned, it's good to see some very familiar faces, as well as some new faces around the screen tonight. And we thank you for joining us. The topic, of course, is Jewish New Mexico military history from 1846 to 1946. A short bio for Naomi, for those of you who may not know her. Naomi Sandweiss Willie is co-president, my partner in crime, of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society and author of the book Jewish Albuquerque from 1860 to 1960. This presentation is a result of a years-long research project of hers funded by the New Mexico History Museum. Naomi was born in Albuquerque, where she lives today, and works as a program manager at the University of New Mexico. One or two quick housekeeping things before I turn it over, and that is please remain muted throughout the discussion so as to avoid any background noise, interference, or what have you. And we will be doing questions and comments through the chat box at the end of the program. So thank you very much for joining us. And Naomi, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thanks to everyone. I also want to say special thanks to the History Museum and also to Diane Layden and to Bob Gale, who in their own ways each helped me with some of the material in this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint, and we are going to go through about 100 years of history. And bear with me because there is no way that we can cover every little bit of this history, but I will do my best to give you the highlights. So I'm going to go ahead and let's see. Can everybody, well, hopefully you can see the PowerPoint and myself. I was especially interested in this topic because I have quite a few veterans in my family, beginning with my grandfather who fought in World War I for the US and continuing throughout this century. So that got me interested, but I want to note that Jewish Americans have participated in the military in one way or another, definitely since the Revolutionary War. And we're not going to be dealing with that because that doesn't coincide with our history of New Mexico that we're covering today. But I do want to acknowledge that. So just so you know, my this has been a year-long project, and my methodology really has been typically both research of the academic sort, but then also reaching out to many organizations, newspapers, oral histories, interviews for those who were more recently involved. And what I'll be sharing today are the highlights of my research. So we're going to start out with the Mexican-American War. From 1846 to 1848. And just to say that, again, I'm not going to be able to share every New Mexican who participated, but this gentleman's face might look familiar to many of you. This is Solomon Jacob Spiegelberg. He was one of several brothers who had recently immigrated from Prussia to the United States and started merchandising along the Santa Fe Trail. Eventually, he served the role of sutler or civilian provisioner for U.S. military forts, specifically Fort Marcy in Santa Fe. And what's interesting and ironic is that many of the early participants in the military in one way or another, Jewish New Mexicans, actually came to the United States to avoid conscription. It is noted, according to a Spiegelberg descendant, that Solomon Jacob and his brothers left their birthplace to avoid conscription. The person notes, the first ones to leave were teenage boys who were facing conscription in the local army. Since they couldn't own land and didn't have citizenship and were being conscripted, they felt there was no future for them in the German states. So Solomon Jacob, along with several other Jewish Americans in New Mexico at the time, participated in providing provisions for the forts. And this was something that, because of trading along the Santa Fe Trail, there was already a capacity to do so. And by putting down roots in one location, i.e. Santa Fe at the time, he was also able to build a business in terms of wholesale and retail business at the time. Somebody else that I wanted to note from the Mexican-American War is this gentleman who was a physician. Dr. David Camden de Leon was actually born in South Carolina and went to medical school in Philadelphia. Interestingly, he fought in the Mexican-American War in Mexico, and it is told that when American military officers were all killed, he actually took command of U.S. forces and brought that group to success as their commander. So De Leon was awarded several congressional awards for his bravery and participation, not only as a doctor, but as a fighter in the Mexican-American War. Later, he resigned from the Army and decided that during the Civil War, which we'll get to shortly, that he would serve with the Confederacy, which was an interesting choice, but given his area where he grew up in South Carolina, not completely unpredictable. After the Civil War, he settled in Mexico, ironically, for a little while, until returning to New Mexico, where he practiced medicine in Santa Fe for a number of years before his death. So another fellow with an interesting overlap with New Mexico history. As we moved to the Civil War, things got a little more complex and nuanced. First of all, there were more Jewish New Mexicans in our area during this time. And of course, here we have a photograph of President Lincoln and General Grant. And as many of you know, in 1862, General Grant banned Jews from his sector of Tennessee, which also included, that sector included Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi. But Lincoln is well known for rescinding that order, restoring the ability of Jews to live in the area, and also appointing for the first time Jewish chaplains in the US military. So this was somewhat of a certainly a conflict between them, but also a turning point for Jews. And I will definitely share some of the anti-Semitism that took place at this time as well, just setting the stage right now. 5,500 Jews fought for the Union nationwide. And I've listed here a number of Jewish New Mexicans who fought for the Union in New Mexico. And one of the most well-known of these individuals is on the left with the hat. This is Louis Felsenthal. Felsenthal actually came to New Mexico from Prussia in 1858. And he, after Governor Connolly called for an organization of militia in New Mexico, as a 29-year-old, Felsenthal volunteered to serve the Union under Colonel Kit Carson. And he was leading men at the Battle of Valverde, and also after the Civil War, had a group of men who moved along the Santa Fe Trail, protecting the trail. But there's some great, Felsenthal kept a diary of his experiences. And here, I just want to read you a little bit from a book about Louis Felsenthal. It's called Citizen Soldier of Territorial New Mexico. Felsenthal's company was one of the earliest to be organized and go on active duty. Although the New Mexicans started from a position of incredible military weakness, the 10 companies of Carson's 1st New Mexico Volunteers fought beside the other Union troops, and Captain Felsenthal and his men were in the midst of the action. It was a grisly theater of death, with round shot and bullets from small arms making a leaden shower of destruction, along with the booming cannons. Like all battles, it was a terrible mixture of acrid smoke and screams of wounded men and blood and fear. So Felsenthal saw more than his share of military action during this time. And as a side note, he was one of the founders of the Historical Society of New Mexico, one of our partner organizations and good friends. And as you can see, there's a number of other names on this list that probably are familiar to those who have studied New Mexico history, including the Seligman family, the Spiegelberg family, the Staub family, and William Zeckendorf, who had businesses in New Mexico before moving to Arizona. You can see here an editorial cartoon of a caricature of a Jewish American, and the caption, the caption reads "Shoddy," or the vulture of the war. At the time, the word shoddy was used to describe Jewish merchants. It was felt that Jewish merchants benefited financially from the war and did not have the wherewithal to fight as soldiers, which is patently untrue. And Jewish Americans served several different roles, including as soldiers, as physicians, and as merchants or suppliers. But in terms of New Mexico, when the Confederates invaded and later occupied Albuquerque and Santa Fe, Jewish merchants found themselves under threat. Henry Lisinski was motivated to enlist in the Union Army after Confederate troops plundered his home because he had provided grain to Union troops. In Santa Fe, goods from the mentioned previously Spiegelberg store were confiscated by the Confederates, and their wives were threatened. So this was certainly a disruption, and there was no profiting. In fact, Lisinski and Zeckendorf actually moved their business operations after the Civil War because they had had such losses as a result of the activities that took place. But nevertheless, this idea of Jews as not being patriotic or as somehow not being willing to put themselves at risk persisted in the national psyche, as we'll see when we cover a few more instances of Jewish involvement in military activities. The Indian Wars, of course, took place very close to home in many in New Mexico. And many Jewish names that, again, are familiar to those who've studied New Mexico history participated, again, as suppliers of the forts, primarily. So Charles Ilfeld and Willie Spiegelberg provided grain and other supplies to forts from Fort Wingate near Gallup to Fort Union and down toward the southern part of the state. And this other gentleman who's listed here first, Ernest, it's alternately listed as Agerstein and Ehrenstein, was an interesting fellow because he actually provided supplies to Bosque Redondo, where both Navajo and Mescalero Apache communities were horribly sent. But Aaronstein or Agerstein was not an American citizen. And during the Civil War, his loyalties were questioned. He had been doing business in Mesilla in the southern part of New Mexico, and someone accused him of being aligned with the Confederacy. So he was required, before the government was willing to do business with him as a supplier, to sign an oath of loyalty to the United States and to the Union, swearing his loyalty. So all of these men struggled during this time period from the late 1860s to 1888 to find enough provisions to actually supply all of these forts. And were some of them were more or less successful in doing so. Later on, in 1896, the Jewish War Veterans of the US was founded. And there's a couple reasons why this is really important to think about in relation to Jewish life in the US. One is this was the period of increasing Eastern European and Jewish immigration, and coinciding with that, increasing anti-Semitism. In 1894, the Dreyfus Affair, in which the French officer was convicted of treason, really amped this up. And many Jews felt like their patriotism was in question, particularly those who had served in the Civil War and wanted to be recognized as such. So in 1895, there was a book published by Simon Wolf, who himself had been an assistant to President Grant. And the book was The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. And he was really trying to counter the narrative that Jewish Americans were not patriotic. And he listed, or attempted to list, all of the Jewish soldiers across the country who had served in the Civil War. Well, of course, this was decades after the Civil War. And since that time, it's been recognized that the publication had a number of errors. Of course, I mean, we're talking about a time when information was not as readily available as it is today. And so recently, there's actually been an online publication that has attempted to correct mistakes that were made in this particular publication. And I have it listed at the end. It's called the Chappell Red Roster of Jewish Service in the American Civil War. And it's a reappraisal of what Simon Wolf had put together. But at the same time, the Jewish War Veterans of the US, which is still operating and quite a live organization, felt it was necessary to advocate on behalf of those who had served in it, particularly in the Civil War. Several years later, when the brief Spanish-American War took place, Jewish Americans were highly involved. This was for several reasons. One was the American Israelite, which was a prominent Jewish newspaper, really promoted Jewish involvement, encouraging individuals to sign up. And yes, it was also read here in New Mexico. People had subscriptions. There were 3 Jewish young men who were part of the Jewish Rough Riders under Theodore Roosevelt's command from New Mexico: Samuel Goldberg, Hyman Lewitsky, and Hyman Rafalowitz. And this was not an easy command to be under. As many of you well know, the soldiers were selected, they trained in San Antonio, and then this particular group moved on to Cuba, where they fought alongside Theodore Roosevelt. And why were New Mexicans so enthusiastic about the Spanish-American War? New Mexicans in particular were enthusiastic because it was thought that participation could also hasten statehood, which was still under question at the time. So the patriotism proven by New Mexicans and by Jews, in this case, was hoped to be an influence. In 1898, the Albuquerque Daily Citizen had a description of Samuel Goldberg's injury as a result of his fighting with Roosevelt at the Battle of San Juan. And it says, Samuel Goldberg from Albuquerque, 22 years of age, was wounded in the hip and for 2 days and nights continued fighting at Roosevelt's side under murderous fire with a bullet in his wound, which was not extracted until the fight was over. So there was significant danger. What is interesting, though, is the points of view of leadership toward Jewish volunteers. So Roosevelt wrote in his book about the book Rough Riders, about some of the Jewish soldiers that he fought with. And I'm just going to read you another short description. This was a little bit about Roosevelt's perception of Jews and others. Theodore Roosevelt, the intrepid leader of the Rough Riders, declared that in that brave regiment, which has challenged the admiration of the world, the most astonishing courage was displayed by the Jewish Rough Riders, one of whom became a lieutenant. He also wrote in his book, a young Jew who developed into one of the best fighters in the regiment accepted with entire equanimity the name Pork Chop. So there was admiration, but there was also definite pointing out of difference and awareness of difference as well. So after the brief Spanish-American War, we move into another role that some Jewish individuals played, which was healthcare. Dr. Daniel Mitchell Apple was born in Philadelphia, where he also received his medical training. And he had served at Fort Stanton in 1878 to 1879. He was one of 5 sons of German-born Jewish parents. And interestingly, just going back a few decades, in 1878, he was involved in providing medical care to those injured in the so-called Lincoln County War, which wasn't a formal war, but a dispute between warring factions in Lincoln County. But for this assignment in 1899, he was assigned to go to Fort Bayard and operate the first tuberculosis hospital run by the U.S. Army. And this was this facility treated veterans with TB, and TB was no small problem at the time. At the time, also cures were tended to be related to weather, fresh air, and diet. And Dr. Apple himself had TB. So, and as many of you know, this was the same period in which the state of New Mexico was becoming well known as a center for so-called lungers to come and receive treatment across the state. But this really was this first evidence of a military-run hospital of both white and Black veterans side by side receiving medical assistance. He was apparently quite successful at it. And during the time he was there, he wrote a number of medical papers about his practices and regiment. For those of you who don't know, Fort Bayard is near Silver City, but at the time there was quite a great deal of travel that the patients had to make to even get to the TB hospital. So this was a complicated activity. Moving forward a few decades, we're now moving into the 1916 and 1917. And you see two photos here. One on the left is Sam Ravel and Brothers, General Merchandise. And the one on the right is entitled Camp Columbus, New Mexico, auto truck supply trains about to leave for Mexico. Well, as many of you, of course, again know, in 1916, Pancho Villa and his men came over the border and raided Columbus, New Mexico, and notably the Ravel Brothers store. And a few years ago at our NMJHS conference, Stacy Ravel, a Barbanel, showed her film Unraveling, which was about her family's experience in Columbus at the time. Well, nearby was Camp Furlong, where 350 federal troops were located. So eventually, when word got out that the Columbus was under attack, several of the troops came to defend the town. And ultimately, what ended up happening, of course, was that there was punitive expeditions into Mexico. One of the other Jewish families that happened to serve Camp Furlong was Henry Capon. Capon and his family were born in Lithuania, and he served as a tailor for the army. Initially, he was in El Paso and then came to Camp Furlong. And eventually, he also opened up his own tailor shop. And in an interview, the 8th child of the Capon family recalled the following. He got into the military part of the tailoring business when he went to El Paso in Columbus, New Mexico. The 10th Cavalry was stationed there. There were Black troops also. He was a tailor there, and that's when he started with the business of military tailoring. Well, eventually, Capon moved his family to Arizona and actually continued in the same line of business, providing tailoring services to military installations there. But there were Jewish individuals who were with the punitive expeditions going into Mexico, which set the stage really for New Mexico's involvement in World War I. And just to, again, lay a groundwork here, World War I coincided with the height of Eastern European Jewish immigration. Soldiers who fought quickly moved from immigrant to soldier. And there were 250,000 Jewish men who served with the US in World War I. And many don't know that New Mexico had a World War I training camp. It was called Camp Cody. It was located near Deming. And the reason for that was because during Pershing's expeditions, that was the site where soldiers had been placed to defend the border. The selective service for World War for the lead up to World War I began in 1917. And in 1918, National Guard troops, primarily from Midwestern states, Kansas, Nebraska, actually were shipped down to Camp Cody and became known as the Sandstorm Division. There were 113 Jews out of about 23,000 personnel at Camp Cody. And what's interesting, we know quite a bit about them. One of the people who was stationed there described the Jews who were at Camp Cody as they came from all parts of the country, as far east as New York City, as far west as San Francisco, and as far north as Duluth. I have the most interesting lot of Jewish men here. I have all classes from the most extreme Orthodox to the most extreme Reform elements. So the other thing Camp Cody was known for was its rugged environment, i.e. the Sandstorm Division, but it is described best by Sam Weintraub. Sam Weintraub kind of epitomized the move from immigrant to soldier. He was born in Russia in 1897 and was growing up in Omaha, Nebraska, working at the Western Union at the time that he joined the National Guard and came down to Camp Cody. And he described his 8-man tent at Camp Cody as having no wooden floors and no sideboards. Weintraub described the results of a windstorm. I leaped out of bed, scrambled into my uniform, and reached for my shoes, nowhere to be found. The sand had blown all night, and somewhere buried deep in that tent were my shoes. So it was not a hospitable environment, but the Jewish soldiers who happened to be stationed there had an interesting experience. And one of them was Jack Borenstein. Borenstein was born in Silver City, New Mexico, and his family had been there since the 1890s. And I was lucky enough to interview his son, Dr. Dan Borenstein. And he shared that his father, his role at Camp Cody, in addition to being stationed there, was as an interpreter. He helped interpret from English to Spanish and vice versa. He also kept a diary of his experiences during training and the war. And it's at the Silver City Museum, and it's very interesting. So he recalled his experience at Camp Cody in France and after the armistice. And I'll just read you a little bit about his diary. And as a very young man, imagine his thoughts here. And this is a photograph, a mirror type photograph where all of those images on the left are Jack Borenstein. May 1918, leave for Camp Cody. Good meat, baked potato, sliced white bread, coffee. Froze all night. May 20th, a Sunday. Everybody cold. Nothing doing all day. June 4th, first time drilled, just for morning, then interpreted. June 12th, drilled and left for a 4-mile hike. Vaccinated, June 15th, 1918, vaccinated, nose bled for half an hour, sore and restless. July 1918, happy as a bartender at a prohibition convention. July 20th, 1918, lonesome. December 20th, 1918, Jewish services. We leave Monday. So he's describing his experience at Camp Cody as alternately boring, lonely, and he was ready to go. The Jewish community in New Mexico supported the soldiers, the Jewish soldiers at Camp Cody. Silver City residents traveled round trip 100 miles. Jewish merchants actually decorated a hall, the Jewish Welfare Board hall, for the men there. So there was a YMCA hall and a Knights of Columbus hall. And even though the Jewish men stationed there were small in number, they were actually had their own Jewish Welfare Board hall. And since we're coming on Passover, I'll just read to you a little bit about what the B'nai B'rith chapter of Omaha, Nebraska sent to the men at Camp Cody in advance of the holiday. It included salami, figs, cakes and candy, cigarettes, cigars, and playing cards. There was some conflict among the recipients on how to deal with the chametz, food not permitted for Passover. An account from the April 4th, 1918 edition of American Israelite provided information on how the conflict was solved. A former yeshiva boy pointed out that the cakes and candies could not be legitimately kept in the building over Passover. After some discussion, it was voted to do away with the chametz, and the doing away process became an enjoyable and impromptu feast. So they ate the evidence there. But for a more serious note here, the Great War, World War I, was a critical moment for interfaith relationships. I mentioned that there were Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish so-called homes or clubhouses for men at Camp Cody. And this was really the first time across the country and in the US military that we saw such organization. There was a committee of 6, and it identified Catholicism and Judaism as religions versus a denomination of Protestantism. And therefore, they were able to create these resources for the soldiers, which included things like prayer books and religious services, as well as activities and social events. So there were many social events, a library, baseball games at Camp Cody, but also it should be noted that there were, for some of the men, this was the first time in many months they had any religious affiliation. The person who was in charge of the Jewish Welfare Board at Camp Cody was named Jack Yellen, and he recalled, under the Jewish Welfare Board, until the Jewish Welfare Board established a branch here, many of them had not attended a religious service of any kind in more than 9 months. While a great deal has been done for the Jewish men in camps near big cities, the boys at Deming have been shamefully neglected, and I hope that Jewish community around Deming will see their duty toward these boys and fulfill it. So there was definitely advocacy on behalf of Jewish soldiers, even at a remote outpost in New Mexico. So the Jewish Welfare Board was also established at this time, as I said, and it encompassed the Interfaith Chaplaincy Corps. So at this time, there were Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant chaplains who equally served soldiers of any religion as part of their duties. So there was a bit of squabbling in the Jewish Welfare Board about what kind of religious materials to provide the soldiers. And eventually there was a prayer book that was put together and given to each of the Jewish soldiers who wanted one. The interwar period, I should mention, between World War I and World War II, in addition to encompassing the Great Depression, was also a time of heightened anti-Semitism in the United States. From anti-Semitic radio shows to surveys that indicated that people felt that Jews were not, shouldn't have the same rights as other Americans. It was a very challenging time, not to mention quotas on education and barriers to employment. But when World War II began, the Jewish Americans played a role in almost every piece of World War II. And I'm going to share a few of the stories of New Mexicans who did as well. And these are not by any means the only New Mexican Jewish individuals who were involved, but I'm just giving you a few highlights here. So the first gentleman here that I want to introduce is Ned Abraham Jr. Abraham was also from Silver City. He was a 3rd generation resident of Silver City. His family owned the Southern Hotel, and he enlisted in the 20th Coast Artillery of the New Mexico National Guard. For those of you who know their experience, the 20th Coast Artillery was one of the New Mexican groups who experienced the Bataan Death March. And the group was described as, quote, a cross-section of New Mexico: professors, students, miners, lumberjacks, cowboys, rodeo performers, sheep herders, farmers, bus drivers. We had Navajos, Pueblos, Apaches, and Zunis. and everyone performed 120%. Ned Abraham was a very young man, and he did survive the Bataan Death March, but unfortunately, he was sent to a Japanese prison camp and died of dysentery there. And his family, of course, greatly mourned his loss. The next individual that I wanted to share something about was Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Spitzer. Spitzer was a son of immigrants who grew up in New York and was trained as an attorney, so a very different role. In 1944, he single-handedly captured 508 German prisoners. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. He was stationed in France at the time, and he was among the first troops to land in France. And there had just been a battle, and they were in a small town, and all of the Germans were hiding in various locations in the town. Spitzer laid aside his personal weapons, walked openly down the street, yelling for the enemy to surrender. The enemy surrendered en masse. So he captured 508 prisoners that day. Can anybody, you can put it in the chat, but wager a guess as to what language he ordered the Germans to surrender in? I will preempt it, but if you guessed Yiddish, you were right. So he spoke out in Yiddish and was able to do this. He did earn the Medal of Honor for his service. He was wounded in November 1944 and was sent home. And then he eventually went to Korea as a career attorney for the US Army, but died of a heart attack during that period of time, and is buried in El Paso in the military cemetery there. Donald Stern was a student at what is now NMSU when he enlisted in the US Army Air Corps in 1944 and was a tail gunner. And his father, Eugene, was an entrepreneur in Las Cruces. And in 1926, his father founded the Las Cruces Mutual Building and Loan Association. And they also owned the White House Department Store and a number of agricultural properties. And while serving in the military, Sergeant Stern was, the plane was shot down, and he was a prisoner of war of the Germans. During the time he was a prisoner of war, he received his family received correspondence regarding his status, and he was liberated by the Russians in 1945. When he returned, he married Estelle Mann and pursued a career in banking. And just a couple more examples, because we are finishing with World War II. But these two gentlemen, interestingly enough, were both German immigrants who came directly to the US, and almost as soon as they did, began their military involvement. Arthur Kingston, who eventually settled in Carlsbad, and Heinz Reh, who was a relative of the Seligman family and worked at the Bernalillo Mercantile. Both of these men served very admirably in World War II. Goldie Gould was part of the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Here she is on the left in the hat, appearing before the barracks at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. Many women had jobs and technical jobs once men were shipped away. And there were over 600 women enlisted in the Women Army Corps, and 45 women from around the country, including Goldie Gould, were stationed at Kirtland Field. And in addition, Jewish women participated in many roles during World War II, including as pilots moving airplanes from base to base so that they were available for use. Finally, if you saw the exhibit at the New Mexico Holocaust Museum, the brother of a previous gentleman who I profiled, Lawrence Larry Ree, was joined the Army at 21 and became a Ritchie boy, one of those who was trained in Maryland, used their German language skills because of their recent immigration. Eventually, he became head of photographic evidence for the Allied prosecution at the Nuremberg trials and returned to New Mexico and worked at Duke City Lumber for the rest of his career. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention the rabbis, particularly chaplains who served the Army. Rabbi Harry Richmond was the rabbi at Congregation Aaron in Southern Colorado and Trinidad when he rode down to Camp Cody and enlisted and was trained at Camp Cody in southern New Mexico. He served as a chaplain on the European front. During the Second World War, he was stationed in Pearl Harbor, and he was one of the very few individuals who provided chaplaincy services after December 7th, 1941. And then he was, it should say here, World War II chaplain on the Pacific Front. Finally, what is the legacy? Many of the men after World War II furthered their education and training through the GI Bill. They founded organizations, both secular and religious, in New Mexico, and solidified their American, so-called American identities, and put any question away as to whether or not they were patriotic. And finally, I have a list of resources to recommend. So I've been talking a long time. I'm going to stop and entertain questions and comments from this very knowledgeable group.
Naomi, thank you very much. I certainly learned a lot in the last 45 minutes and recognized many names and others that I did not know who participated in the military over that 100-year time frame. So thank you. So the chat box is open for any questions or comments. I will try to monitor that, and if I get stuck, I'll ask Naomi for help. But she's more than happy to entertain questions or comments that you might have.
Linda, can people unmute and ask a question or raise their hand?
We can do that, sure.
Okay.
Let's see. I'm having a hard time here. Well, there's one question in the chat box. Naomi, maybe you can unmute.
Sure.
People for me. But let me, the first question is from Liz Levine here in Santa Fe. I'm curious what parents of the young men who enlisted before World War I thought about their enlisting in the military.
That's a really good question. What's interesting about New Mexico Jewish history is many Jewish families sent their sons to the New Mexico Military Institute in Roswell in lieu of other educational opportunities in the state. And I'm talking up and through the 1930s. And I haven't even addressed, many other pieces of this story, which would take way too long. But I'm thinking that some of the parents were supportive if they were willing to send their sons to school at NMI of enlistment. It meant different things at different times, of course.
Yeah, one of our attendees has asked if there is a way we can share the list of resources. Naomi, I think if you can send those to me, I can in turn make sure that those get out to our folks this evening, because there's a great bibliography and resource list that you've put together and shared so far.
I'm happy to do that.
Okay, good, good. Other questions?
Questions, or if anybody wants to share any
Information they might have, or
right
family
or,
knowledge or thereof, yeah. Okay. Here's a comment / question from a member up in Los Alamos. I read some women's names. What role did they play?
that's a really good question. Officially, women didn't play a military role until later in this narrative. And like I said, they played in a number of roles during World War II. In particular, there were women in New Mexico running religious services down in Deming at the airfield there. As I said, working in flight positions, moving airplanes around, and many, many other positions. Up until that time, women served more supporting roles. I haven't come across Jewish nurse information yet, but I imagine that may have been the case prior to the World War II period.
Okay. Somewhat outside the realm of your time frame, but and I think we also have Jack Schlachter here tonight, but the question is, what about the Jews who worked on the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos?
Well, Jack Schlachter is the source of all information on that. But I will say that there were local New Mexico Jewish men, in addition to Jewish men who came from other places, who served at Los Alamos, including one member of the Ilfeld family who had gone to MIT and then was assigned to the Manhattan Project. So there were, and Jack can provide more information on many Jews and their levels of participation. But I will say that the rabbi in Albuquerque at the time could not tell his congregants where he was going when he went to Los Alamos to provide pastoral care or services. And so his congregants began to get irritated at him because he was gone. And eventually he was able to share where he was, of course. But there were religious services. There was a Passover Seder at in Los Alamos. So, but again, I defer to those who know much more than I do about that.
Okay. Another question, did the fact that Jewish men enlisted in the Confederate Army cause the victorious Union to regard them as, quote, Jewish traitors?
I'm going to venture a guess that they were regarded as Southern traitors. And for the individual that I profiled, De Leon, he himself, the reason he went to Mexico, it was because he couldn't stand that the South had lost. And then somehow ended up in New Mexico, like I said, practicing medicine. So I think it very much depended on the individuals, but I don't know that they were Jewish traitors as much as Southern traitors.
Yeah. And of course, there's a lot of information about Jewish Confederate soldiers,
Yes.
as well as, of course, Union. But there were some prominent people, not only in the military, but in the Confederate government.
And recently there's a book out about a Civil War diary. This doesn't have to do with New Mexico, but a Civil War diary of a Jewish woman. And that is next on my reading list. So
Good. Any other questions or comments before we wrap things up this evening? Naomi, I know you'll make yourself available after the program if people have other specific questions that they'd like to ask you. So thank you. And so for everyone here this evening, we appreciate your tuning in. The session was recorded, and we will have someone do some minor editing, and it will go up on our dedicated YouTube channel, probably in about a week or 10 days time, but an email will go out to our members and friends. And one comment to you, Naomi, this was an excellent, informative presentation. Naomi, you did a superb job, and I certainly echo that. You've done a lot of good work and interesting work. So
Thank you.
with that, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and have a good evening. And for those who observe Passover, have a good Passover. Bye-bye.